The gunshot echoed across the valley like thunder, sending a flock of startled ravens into the crimson sky of 1875. Mason Forrester pressed his back against the rocky outcrop, blood trickling from the fresh wound that would forever mark his face. His fingers trembled as they touched the deep gash running from his right temple down to his jaw, courtesy of a ricocheting bullet and sharp stone. He'd survived, but something told him he would never be the same again. Fort Lyon, Colorado was supposed to be a fresh start, not another battlefield. Mason had left the violence of his past behind, or so he'd thought. The war had been over for a decade, but some men carried it within them like a sickness. "Looks like you'll need stitches," said Tobias, his trail partner, examining the wound. "Town's just beyond that ridge." "Doc Pritchett might be drunk, but his hands are steady enough." Mason nodded, wrapping a bandana around his face. "Let's get the cattle to market first. I didn't drive 2,000 head across 3 territories to lose them now." The journey to Fort Lyon had been grueling. What started as a simple cattle drive from Texas had turned complicated when rustlers attacked their camp 3 nights ago. They'd fought them off, but not before Mason took a bullet that grazed his face and sent him crashing into the rocky terrain. Now, as they approached the settlement, Mason couldn't shake the feeling that this place would change him in ways he couldn't yet understand. Fort Lyon sat nestled in the Arkansas River Valley, a hub for traders, soldiers, and settlers pushing westward. Originally a military post, it had grown into a proper town with a main street lined with false-fronted buildings, a general store, a bank, 2 saloons, a small church, and other establishments necessary for frontier life. Mason and Tobias herded their cattle into the stockyard at the edge of town. The foreman counted the livestock, eyebrows rising in appreciation. "Fine herd," he remarked, scratching numbers in a ledger. 2,012 head, healthiest bunch I've seen this season." "They should be," Mason replied, voice tight with pain. "We took the long route through better grazing land." After completing the transaction and securing their payment, Tobias clapped Mason on the shoulder. "Let's get you to that doctor before your face falls off. Then I'm headed to the saloon. A man's got priorities." The doctor's office was a small wooden structure with a painted sign hanging crookedly above the door. Inside, the smell of carbolic acid and whiskey created a pungent atmosphere. Dr. Pritchett, a balding man with spectacles perched on his bulbous nose, examined Mason's wound with surprising gentleness. "Nasty cut," he commented, cleaning the wound. "It'll heal, but you'll carry this mark to your grave, son." "Just stitch it up," Mason grunted. The procedure was excruciating. Each puncture of the needle sent waves of pain radiating through his skull, but Mason remained stoic. When it was done, the doctor handed him a small brown bottle. "Laudanum. For the pain, change the bandage daily and come back in a week so I can remove the stitches." Mason nodded his thanks, paid the doctor, and stepped back onto the dusty street. The sun was setting now, painting the town in amber hues. He touched the bandage covering half his face, wondering how bad the scar would be once it healed. Not that it mattered, a cowboy's looks were the least of his concerns. He made his way to the hotel, a modest 2-story building with a wide porch. Inside, a thin man with a neat mustache stood behind the registration desk. "Room for the night," Mason said, placing coins on the counter. The clerk eyed his bandaged face with undisguised curiosity but didn't comment. "Second floor, 3rd door on the right. Bathhouse is out back if you're inclined." Mason took the key and climbed the creaking stairs, his body finally registering the exhaustion of the past weeks. The room was simple: a bed, a dresser, a washstand, and a window overlooking the main street. He dropped his saddlebags on the floor and collapsed onto the bed, not bothering to remove his boots. Sleep came in fitful bursts, interrupted by throbbing pain and vivid dreams of the war, of cattle stampedes, and of faceless men with guns. When morning light streamed through the thin curtains, Mason rose feeling more tired than when he'd lain down. In the communal washroom, he removed the bandage to clean his wound as instructed. The mirror revealed what he'd feared: an angry red line bisecting his face, puckered with fresh stitches. The cut started just beneath his right eye, curved along his cheekbone, and ended at his jawline. Even after it healed, the scar would be unmistakable. Mason replaced the bandage and headed downstairs for breakfast. The dining room was nearly empty, save for a few early risers. He took a table in the corner, ordered coffee and eggs, and reviewed his plans. With the cattle sold, he had enough money to start fresh. Perhaps buy some land, build something permanent. At 32, he was weary of the constant movement, the transient nature of a cowboy's existence. As he ate, the dining room began to fill. A boisterous family took the table next to his parents with 3 children, all talking excitedly about their journey west. Mason kept his head down, uncomfortable with the stares his bandaged face attracted. "Pardon me, sir," a female voice interrupted his thoughts. "But would you mind if I borrowed your salt? Ours seems to have gone missing." Mason looked up into the most remarkable pair of hazel eyes he'd ever seen. They belonged to a woman perhaps in her mid-20s, with auburn hair swept into a practical bun and skin lightly freckled from the sun. She wore a simple blue dress, modest but well-made. "Of course," he replied, sliding the salt cellar toward her. "Thank you kindly." She smiled, a genuine expression that reached her eyes. "I'm Olivia Sutton. My brother and I just arrived in Fort Lyon yesterday." Mason hesitated, unused to casual conversation, particularly with women. "Mason Forrester," he finally offered. "Pleased to meet you, Mr. Forrester." She gestured to his face. "I hope I'm not being too forward, but my father was a doctor in St. Louis. I assisted him often. If you're in need of any medicinal herbs for that wound, I have some in my trunk that work wonders for healing." Before Mason could respond, a young man appeared at her side. "Liv, the wagon's loaded. We should head out if we want to reach the homestead by midday." He nodded politely to Mason. "Good day, sir." "My brother, William," Olivia explained. "We've purchased land about 10 miles east of town." She rose from her chair. "It was nice meeting you, Mr. Forrester. I hope your injury heals quickly." And then she was gone, leaving Mason staring after her, the salt cellar still on his table. Something about her directness, her lack of discomfort at his injury, stayed with him as he finished his meal. Outside, the town was coming to life. Merchants opened their shops, a wagon loaded with lumber creaked past, and the blacksmith's hammer created a rhythmic backdrop to the morning bustle. Mason headed to the general store to purchase supplies. The proprietor, a portly man named Jenkins, helped him gather what he needed while making friendly conversation. "Passing through or staying a spell?" Jenkins asked as he calculated the total. "Not sure yet," Mason admitted. "Might look for land if the right opportunity presents itself." Jenkins' eyes lit up. "Well, as it happens, old man Becker passed last winter. His place about 12 miles east of town has been sitting empty. Good water, decent grazing land. His nephew's selling it for a fair price, just wants to be rid of it." He leaned in conspiratorially. "Between you and me, I hear the bank might even offer terms to the right buyer." Mason considered this information. "I'll look into it. Thanks." With his supplies loaded on his horse, Mason rode to the bank to inquire about the Becker property. The banker, a thin man named Harrison with calculating eyes, confirmed Jenkins' information. 200 acres, small cabin, barn needs work. $500 with terms available for someone with good character. Harrison's eyes flickered to Mason's bandaged face. "Of course, we'd need references." "I can pay cash," Mason replied coldly, pulling out a portion of his cattle earnings. "When can I see the property?" Harrison's demeanor changed instantly. "I can have someone take you out there tomorrow morning if that suits." Mason nodded. "I'll be here at 8. He spent the remainder of the day exploring Fort Lyon, getting a feel for the community. The town had a surprisingly orderly feel for a frontier settlement. In addition to the businesses on Main Street, there was a schoolhouse, a small sheriff's office, and scattered residences. People went about their business with purpose, many nodding politely as he passed. As evening approached, Mason decided to visit one of the saloons, the Silver Dollar, which looked more respectable than its counterpart down the street. Inside, the atmosphere was lively but not rowdy. A piano player in the corner tapped out a jaunty tune, and the bar was doing steady business. Mason ordered whiskey and found a quiet table where he could observe the room. Tobias appeared shortly after, slapping Mason on the back. "There you are, thought you might have lit out without saying goodbye." "Just exploring options," Mason replied. "Might buy some land nearby." Tobias whistled low. "Settling down, never thought I'd see the day." He lowered his voice. "How's the face? It'll heal." Speaking of healing, Tobias nodded toward the entrance. "Isn't that the woman you mentioned from breakfast?" Mason turned to see Olivia Sutton entering the saloon alongside her brother. She wore the same blue dress, but had added a shawl against the evening chill. Several heads turned to watch her progress through the room, but she moved with confidence, seemingly unbothered by the attention. The siblings took a table not far from Mason's. William left briefly to fetch drinks from the bar, and in that moment Olivia looked up and caught Mason's eye. She smiled in recognition and, to his surprise, rose and approached his table. "Mr. Forrester, what a coincidence." "How is your wound today?" Mason touched the bandage self-consciously. "Better, thank you." Tobias cleared his throat pointedly, and Mason reluctantly made introductions. "Miss Sutton, this is Tobias Reed, my trail partner. Tobias, Miss Olivia Sutton." "A pleasure, madam," Tobias said, tipping his hat with exaggerated courtesy. "Any friend of Mason's is a friend of mine, though he doesn't have many, being the unsociable sort." Olivia laughed, a light sound that seemed to brighten the dim saloon. "Well, I hope to change that. My brother and I are new to the area as well. We could all use friends in a new place." William returned with their drinks and was introduced to Mason and Tobias. The young man had a firm handshake and direct gaze, reminding Mason of many soldiers he'd known, though he couldn't be more than 22 or 23. "Miss Sutton mentioned you purchased land east of town," Mason said. William nodded. "Our father left us enough to start fresh after he passed. The war took everything else from our family in Missouri." Mason understood all too well. The war had redrawn the map of many lives, not just geography. "I'm looking at land myself, the old Becker place." "Our neighbor then," Olivia exclaimed. "We're just a few miles from there. The Sanchez family is between us, lovely people with 2 young daughters." The conversation flowed surprisingly easily. Mason learned that the Suttons had left St. Louis after their father's death, seeking a new beginning away from painful memories. William had apprenticed as a carpenter, and Olivia had her father's medical knowledge. They planned to farm and raise horses on their new property. "And what of your plans, Mr. Forrester?" Olivia asked, her hazel eyes intent on his face. "Cattle, probably, it's what I know." Mason shifted uncomfortably under her steady gaze. Few people looked directly at him since his injury. "Well, I'm headed to Pueblo tomorrow," Tobias announced, draining his glass. "Got a cousin there needs help with his freight business. Mason, it's been a fine run." He extended his hand. "Take care of that ugly face of yours." Mason shook his friend's hand, feeling a twinge of melancholy. They'd ridden together for 3 years, and though they weren't close in the way some men were, they'd developed a comfortable companionship. After Tobias departed, William excused himself to speak with a man he recognized from their journey to Fort Lyon, leaving Mason alone with Olivia. An awkward silence fell between them. "Your brother seems capable," Mason finally said. "He is," Olivia agreed. "He fought in the war, though he was barely 18 when it ended. It aged him beyond his years." She studied Mason thoughtfully. "You served as well, I think." Mason nodded, surprised by her perception. "Confederate cavalry, not something I advertise these days." "The war is over, Mr. Forrester. We're all just people trying to rebuild now." She leaned forward slightly. "May I ask how you were injured? Your wound doesn't look like it came from a typical accident." "Rustlers. 3 nights ago, bullet ricocheted and sent me into some rocks." Olivia winced in sympathy. "Have you changed the bandage today? Wounds like that can fester quickly." "Not yet," he admitted. "I could help if you'd allow it. I have my medical kit with me at the hotel." Mason stared at her, taken aback by the offer. "That's not necessary, Miss Sutton." "It's no trouble, and please call me Olivia." Her expression grew serious. "Infection isn't something to trifle with, Mr. Forrester. I've seen strong men die from wounds smaller than yours." Before Mason could respond, William returned to the table. "Time we headed back to the hotel, Liv." We've got an early start tomorrow. Olivia rose, gathering her shawl. Think about my offer, Mr. Forrester. Room 12 if you change your mind. She smiled once more and departed with her brother, leaving Mason to contemplate her words. He ordered another whiskey, mulling over the strange turn of events. There was something refreshing about Olivia Sutton's straightforward manner. No artifice, no excessive sympathy or disgust at his injury, just practical concern. It had been a long time since anyone had shown such interest in his welfare. An hour later, Mason found himself outside room 12, hand raised to knock, questioning his own judgment. Before he could reconsider, the door opened and Olivia stood before him, her hair now hanging loose around her shoulders. "I was beginning to think you wouldn't come," she said, stepping aside to let him enter. The room was similar to his own, though more organized, with a trunk open at the foot of the bed revealing neatly folded clothing. "I don't want to impose," Mason said stiffly. "Nonsense. Sit by the window, the light's better there." She gestured to a chair, then moved to the washstand where she'd already laid out medical supplies, clean cloths, a bottle of alcohol, and a small tin of salve. Mason sat awkwardly, watching as she efficiently prepared her materials. When she turned to face him, her expression was professionally detached. "I'll need to remove the bandage. It might stick a bit if there's dried blood." Mason nodded, steeling himself. Her fingers were gentle as they unwound the bandage, careful not to pull at the wound. When his face was exposed, he resisted the urge to turn away, not wanting to see the disgust that would surely cross her features. Instead, Olivia leaned closer, examining the stitches with clinical interest. "Dr. Pritchett did a decent job, though his stitches are a bit uneven. This will scar, but the wound itself is clean." She dipped a cloth in water and began to carefully clean around the stitches. "Did he give you anything for pain?" "Laudanum. Haven't used it." She nodded approvingly. "Good. That stuff creates more problems than it solves. This salve is better yarrow and comfrey with a bit of honey. It will reduce swelling and help prevent infection." Her touch was light as she applied the salve along the wound. Mason sat perfectly still, acutely aware of her proximity, the faint scent of lavender that clung to her skin, the steady rhythm of her breathing. It had been years since he'd been this close to a woman. "There," she said at last, applying a fresh bandage. "Change it again tomorrow. The stitches should come out in about 5 days." "Thank you," Mason said, rising from the chair. "I appreciate your help, Miss Olivia." She smiled at his correction. "You're welcome, Mr. Forrester." "Mason," he offered. "If we're to be neighbors." "Mason," she repeated, her voice soft. "I look forward to it." The next morning, Mason met with the banker as arranged and rode out to view the Becker property. The land was better than he'd expected, rolling hills with good grass, a creek running through the eastern portion, and enough flat ground for farming if he chose. The cabin was small but solidly built, needing only minor repairs. The barn, as Jenkins had mentioned, required more work, but its foundation was sound. By noon, Mason had made his decision. He returned to the bank, paid the full amount from his cattle earnings, and signed the necessary papers. By mid-afternoon, he was the owner of 200 acres of Colorado soil, more land than he'd ever thought to possess. He spent the next 2 days purchasing supplies and hiring laborers to help with the barn repairs. On the third day, he loaded his wagon and headed east out of Fort Lyon toward his new home. The journey took just over 2 hours, the wagon laden with tools, seed, foodstuffs, and other necessities. As he crested the final hill that overlooked his property, Mason felt a sense of rightness settle over him. The cabin stood in a small clearing, sheltered by cottonwood trees with mountains visible in the distance. It wasn't grand, but it was a place to build something lasting. He'd just finished unloading the wagon when the sound of hoofbeats drew his attention. Turning, he saw 2 riders approaching Olivia and William Sutton. They waved in greeting as they neared. "Welcome home, neighbor," William called, dismounting. "Thought you might appreciate some help getting settled." "And a proper meal," Olivia added, holding up a basket. "No one should eat their own cooking on their first night in a new home." Mason was touched by the gesture, though he tried not to show it. "That's kind of you both." The three spent the afternoon working together, Mason and William reinforcing a section of the barn roof, while Olivia tidied the cabin's interior and prepared dinner. The simple domestic scene struck Mason as surreal after years of trail drives and temporary camps. Yet there was comfort in it, a glimpse of what normal life might be. As the sun began to set, they gathered around the rough-hewn table in the cabin to share the meal. Olivia had prepared rabbit stew with biscuits, followed by apple pie she'd purchased from the hotel kitchen in Fort Lyon. "To new beginnings," William said, raising his coffee cup in a toast. "And good neighbors," Olivia added, her eyes meeting Mason's. Mason raised his cup as well, surprised by the emotion that threatened to overwhelm him. "To both," he managed. After dinner, William excused himself to check on their horses, leaving Mason and Olivia alone by the fireplace. She examined his wound again, nodding with satisfaction at its progress. "It's healing well," she said, applying more of her salve. "The redness is already fading." "Thanks to your care," Mason replied. Olivia's fingers lingered near his jaw. "The scar will fade somewhat with time, though it will always be visible." Her eyes met his, candid and warm. "But it's just a mark, Mason. It doesn't define you." Something in her words, or perhaps her touch, broke through a barrier within him. "I've seen how people look at me now. It's different. People fear what reminds them of their own vulnerability," she said softly. "A visible wound makes them confront what they'd rather forget, that we're all just flesh and bone, easily broken." Her hand moved to rest lightly on his forearm. "But there are those who see beyond such things." The moment stretched between them, charged with unspoken meaning. Then William returned, breaking the spell, and the Suttons prepared to depart. "We'll be back to help with the barn on Saturday," William said, shaking Mason's hand. "Neighbors need to stick together out here." As they rode away, Mason stood in the doorway of his cabin, watching until they disappeared over the hill. The evening was quiet save for the whisper of wind through the cottonwoods and the distant call of a nighthawk. For the first time in years, he felt the stirring of hope, a dangerous, fragile thing that he scarcely dared acknowledge. The days fell into a rhythm as spring deepened into summer. Mason worked from dawn till dusk, repairing the barn, mending fences, and preparing to purchase his first small herd of cattle. The Suttons were true to their word, becoming regular visitors to his homestead as he was to theirs. William proved to be an excellent carpenter, helping Mason add a lean-to kitchen to the cabin and completely renovate the barn. In return, Mason assisted with breaking ground for the Suttons' vegetable garden and constructing a proper chicken coop. The siblings had ambitious plans for their land crops, chickens, and eventually a small horse breeding operation, building on William's knowledge of horseflesh gained during the war. Olivia's presence became a constant in Mason's life, a brightness he hadn't known he was missing. She brought meals, tended his wound until the stitches were removed, and shared books from her small but treasured collection. Sometimes they would sit on his porch in the evening, watching the sunset while she read aloud Dickens, Twain, or poetry that made Mason think of things beyond survival for the first time in years. His scar healed into a silvery line down his face, less angry but still prominent. He grew accustomed to seeing it in his shaving mirror each morning, though he noticed how children in town still stared and some women averted their eyes. Olivia never did. She looked at him directly, her gaze clear and unflinching. By mid-July, Mason had purchased 20 head of cattle and 2 horses, the beginnings of the ranch he envisioned. The barn was fully repaired, and he'd built a sturdy corral adjacent to it. The cabin was taking shape as well, the lean-to kitchen completed, new windows installed, and a proper bed replacing the simple pallet he'd used initially. On a particularly hot Saturday, Mason rode to the Sutton place to help William construct an irrigation system from the creek that bordered their property. Olivia was tending her thriving garden when he arrived, her skin flushed from the heat, a wide-brimmed hat shielding her face from the sun. "Mason," she called, setting down her tools and coming to meet him. "You're just in time. William's gone to help the Sanchez family. Their wagon broke an axle on the way back from town. Mason dismounted, leading his horse to the water trough. "I can come back another day." "Nonsense," she insisted. "I could use the help with the irrigation channels." William marked everything out before he left. They worked side by side throughout the morning, digging channels from the creek to the fields. The labor was hard in the summer heat, but Mason found comfort in the physical exertion and Olivia's company. They spoke easily now, sharing stories and opinions as they worked. By midday, they were both sweat-soaked and dusty. Olivia pushed back her hat, wiping her brow with her forearm. "I think we've earned a rest. I made cold tea this morning. It should be perfect now." They settled in the shade of a large oak tree, drinking the sweet tea and sharing the bread and cheese Olivia had prepared. A comfortable silence fell between them, broken only by the buzzing of insects and the distant lowing of cattle. "I never properly thanked you," Mason said suddenly. Olivia looked at him quizzically. "For what? For not looking away from this?" He gestured to his scar. "Most people do." She studied him thoughtfully, her hazel eyes direct as always. "Most people are afraid of reminders that life is unpredictable, that safety is an illusion." She leaned back against the tree trunk. "But I've always believed in looking directly at things as they are. It's the only way to truly understand them." "Is that what you're doing with me, trying to understand?" A smile played at the corners of her mouth. "Perhaps. You're not as simple as you'd have people believe, Mason Forrester." "Neither are you," he countered, surprising himself with his boldness. Olivia's smile widened. "Good, I'd hate to be predictable." She tilted her head, considering him. "May I ask you something personal?" Mason nodded, curious. "Why did you decide to stay here? You could have continued with the cattle drives or gone anywhere after the sale." It was a question he'd asked himself many times over the past months. "I was tired," he answered honestly. "Of moving, of never belonging anywhere. After the war, I drifted because it seemed easier than trying to rebuild something permanent." He looked out across the rolling landscape of their adjoining properties. "But then I saw this place and something just fit." Olivia's expression softened. "I understand that feeling. When William and I first saw our land, I felt like I could breathe again for the first time since Father died." She reached out impulsively, her hand covering his. "I'm glad you stayed." The warmth of her touch sent an unexpected jolt through Mason. Her hand was work-roughened, but still feminine, strong, and capable. Before he could respond, the sound of an approaching wagon interrupted the moment. William returned shortly after, weary but satisfied with the successful repair of the Sanchez wagon. The three of them completed the irrigation work before sunset, and Mason declined their invitation to stay for dinner, feeling suddenly overwhelmed by emotions he wasn't prepared to examine. As summer progressed into early autumn, Mason's feelings for Olivia deepened in ways that both exhilarated and terrified him. She had become essential to his new life, her visits, something he anticipated with an eagerness that surprised him. Her absence leaving his cabin feeling emptier than its modest size warranted. Yet he hesitated to speak of these feelings, uncertain whether she could truly care for a man with his past and his scars, both visible and hidden. The war had left marks beyond the physical nightmares that still woke him sweating in the darkness, memories of actions taken in the name of duty that now seemed impossible to justify. On a crisp September evening, Mason rode into Fort Lyon for supplies and to post a letter to his sister in Tennessee, his only remaining family, though they'd grown distant over the years. As he exited the general store, he noticed a commotion near the bank. A crowd had gathered, voices raised in anger. Approaching cautiously, Mason saw William Sutton in heated conversation with Harrison, the banker. Olivia stood beside her brother, her posture rigid with tension. "Everything all right?" Mason asked, joining them. Relief flickered across Olivia's face. "Mason, thank goodness. Perhaps you can help us make sense of this." William's expression was thunderous. "The bank is foreclosing on the Sanchez property. They've given them 1 week to vacate." "On what grounds?" Mason asked, surprised. The Sanchez family, a husband, wife, and 2 young daughters, were hardworking and well-respected. Harrison straightened his vest nervously. "Mr. Sanchez took a loan last winter for seed and equipment. The terms were clear: payment due in full by September 1st. It's now September 7th. He's only a week late, Olivia protested. And only because the cattle buyer from Denver was delayed. Miguel has the money now. He was coming to pay today. Rules are rules, Miss Sutton, Harrison replied stiffly. The bank has already accepted another offer for the property. From whom? Mason's voice was quiet but carried an edge that made Harrison step back slightly. The banker glanced around nervously. That's confidential information, Mr. Forrester. It's that land speculator from Kansas City, interjected Jenkins, the store owner, who had joined the gathering. Blackwell or Blackford, something like that, been buying up properties all over the county. Blackwood, Harrison corrected automatically, then looked chagrined at his slip. Mason exchanged a look with William. They'd both heard rumors about Edmund Blackwood, a wealthy businessman with political connections who'd been acquiring land throughout Colorado Territory, often through questionable means. The Sanchez family has worked that land for 3 years, William argued. They've improved it, made it productive. You can't just take it from them over a week's delay. I'm afraid the matter is settled, Harrison replied, though he couldn't quite meet William's eyes. Now, if you'll excuse me, I have business to attend to. As the banker retreated into the building, the crowd began to disperse, murmuring in disapproval. Mason turned to the Suttons. Where is Miguel now? At our place, Olivia answered. Elena and the girls are with him. They came to us when they received the notice this morning. This isn't right, William said, his hands clenching into fists. There has to be something we can do. Mason considered the situation. Let's speak with Sheriff Davis. He might have some insight. The sheriff's office was a small building at the end of Main Street. Inside, they found Davis, a barrel-chested man with a gray streaked beard, reviewing wanted posters at his desk. He listened to their story with a thoughtful expression. I sympathize with the Sanchez family, he said when they'd finished, but legally the bank is within its rights. If the loan terms specified payment by September 1st with foreclosure as a consequence of default, there's not much to be done. Even if Blackwood somehow influenced the bank to enforce those terms strictly, Mason asked. Seems convenient that he had an offer ready the moment Miguel was late with payment. Sheriff Davis stroked his beard. That would be difficult to prove. Blackwood is well connected with friends in the territorial government. He leaned forward, lowering his voice. Between us, I don't trust the man. 3 other small ranchers in the county have lost their land to similar circumstances in the past year, but without evidence of wrongdoing, my hands are tied. As they left the sheriff's office, Mason's mind was working through possibilities. We need to speak with Miguel directly. Perhaps there's a detail we're missing. They rode back to the Sutton homestead in grim silence. The situation struck too close to home for all of them hard-working people, losing everything through what appeared to be deliberate manipulation, rather than honest business. Miguel Sanchez was a proud man in his early 40s, with intelligent eyes and a quiet dignity that even his current circumstances couldn't diminish. His wife Elena sat beside him at the Suttons' table, their daughters playing quietly in the corner of the main room. I appreciate your concern, Miguel said after they'd related their conversations in town, but I fear there is nothing to be done. The banker is correct, I was late with payment. But why would they refuse your money now? Olivia asked. You're only a week late and you have the full amount. Miguel exchanged a glance with his wife before answering. 2 months ago, a man came to our farm well-dressed from the city. He offered to buy our land for twice what we paid originally. When I refused, he became unpleasant. He said I would regret not accepting his generous offer. Blackwood, William said grimly, had to be. He did not give his name, Miguel continued, but 3 days later I received a letter from the bank reminding me of the exact due date of my loan and emphasizing that no grace period would be extended. That can't be legal, Olivia protested. Legal or not, it's happening, Mason said. The question is, what can we do about it? He turned to Miguel. You said you have the full payment now, Miguel nodded. Every dollar plus the interest specified in the agreement. Mason thought for a moment, then reached a decision. Tomorrow morning, we'll go to the bank together. Miguel will attempt to make his payment with all of us as witnesses. If Harrison refuses, it will at least demonstrate bad faith on the bank's part. And if that doesn't work, Alina spoke for the first time, her voice soft but steady. Mason met her gaze directly. Then we'll find another way. They arrived at Fort Lyon's bank early the next morning. Mason, William, Olivia, and Miguel. The small bank was just opening, and Harrison looked distinctly uncomfortable at the sight of them entering together. "Mr. Sanchez," he greeted stiffly, "I believe I made the situation clear yesterday." "I have come to pay my loan in full, as agreed," Miguel replied, placing a canvas bag on the counter. $563, the principal plus interest. Harrison glanced nervously toward the bank's back office. "As I explained, the deadline has passed. The property has been reassigned. We're witnesses that Mr. Sanchez is attempting to fulfill his obligation," William stated loudly enough for the two other customers in the bank to hear. "If you refuse this payment, it will be clear that the bank is acting in bad faith." The door to the back office opened, revealing a tall man in an expensive suit. His hair was silver at the temples, his face weathered but distinguished. When he spoke, his voice carried the refined accent of an Eastern education. "Perhaps I can clarify matters," he said, approaching the counter. "Edmund Blackwood, at your service." He nodded toward the group. "The bank has indeed transferred Mr. Sanchez's debt to me, along with the deed to the property as collateral. Any payment would now come to me directly." Mason studied the man carefully. There was nothing overtly threatening in his manner. In fact, he projected an air of reasonable authority, but something in his eyes reminded Mason of certain officers he'd known during the war, men who viewed others as pieces on a chessboard. "Then Mr. Sanchez will pay you directly," Olivia stated, her chin raised defiantly. Blackwood smiled, though the expression didn't reach his eyes. "I'm afraid it's not that simple, Miss Sutton, Olivia Sutton, Miss Sutton. You see, I've already invested in improvements for the property based on my acquisition. The situation has changed," he turned to Miguel. "However, I'm not unreasonable. I could offer you employment as a foreman on what was your land. The house would remain yours to live in." "Working my own land for wages?" Miguel's voice was quiet but resolute. "No, senor, that I cannot do," Blackwood shrugged as if the matter were of little importance. "As you wish. The eviction notice stands. You have until Saturday to vacate." "This isn't over," William said, his hand moving instinctively to where a sidearm would be had he been wearing one. "I believe it is, young man." Blackwood's voice hardened slightly. "Unless you're suggesting something outside the law, I wouldn't advise that course of action." His gaze shifted to Mason, noting the scar that ran down his face. "The law tends to side with those who respect its authority." Mason met his gaze steadily. "As does justice, eventually." Blackwood's smile tightened. "Philosophy from a cowboy, how unexpected." He turned back toward his office. "Good day to you all. Mr. Sanchez, I'll send men on Saturday to ensure the property is cleared." Outside the bank, the group conferred quietly. Miguel's expression was resigned, but William was seething with anger, and Olivia's eyes shimmered with unshed tears of frustration. "We can't let this happen," she insisted. "The Sanchez family will lose everything they've worked for." Mason's mind was racing through options, few of them good. Direct confrontation with Blackwood would be risky. The man clearly had influence with local authorities. Legal recourse seemed unlikely given the technical legitimacy of the foreclosure. "Miguel," he said finally, "would you consider selling your cattle and equipment to me at fair market value?" Miguel looked surprised. "My animals and tools." "Why would you?" "Because those weren't included in the loan collateral," Mason explained. "They're still yours to sell. At least you'd have something to start over with." Understanding dawned in Miguel's eyes. "Yes, I would consider this." "Good. And if you need a place to stay temporarily, my barn has a clean loft that could accommodate your family until you decide your next move." "Our home as well," Olivia added quickly. "We have the space." Miguel's proud shoulders slumped slightly in relief. "You are good neighbors." "Better than we deserve." It's what anyone would do, William said, though they all knew that wasn't true. As they prepared to leave town, Sheriff Davis approached their group. He spoke quietly, glancing around to ensure they weren't overheard. Blackwood's staying at the hotel for the next few days. Has 2 men with him hired guns by the look of them. The sheriff's expression was troubled. I can't officially advise against the eviction, but I want you to be careful. Blackwood doesn't strike me as a man who accepts defeat gracefully. Mason nodded his thanks for the warning. As they rode back toward their properties, he found himself beside Olivia, their horses walking at an easy pace. You're very quiet, she observed. What are you thinking? That there's more to this than a simple foreclosure, Mason replied. Blackwood could buy plenty of land without resorting to these tactics. He's targeting specific properties for a reason. Olivia considered this. The Sanchez land borders both of ours, and the Peterson place that was foreclosed on last winter connects to it on the east side. Exactly. He's assembling something larger piece by piece. Mason's expression darkened, and I doubt he'll stop with the Sanchez property. They rode in silence for a moment before Olivia spoke again. What you offered Miguel back there, it was kind. Mason shrugged uncomfortably. It's practical. He needs the money and I can use the additional cattle. Olivia smiled knowingly. You don't fool me, Mason Forrester. Beneath that gruff exterior beats a good heart. Her expression grew serious. It's one of the things I admire most about you. Before Mason could respond, William rode up to join them, and the moment passed. But Olivia's words stayed with him, warming something long cold within his chest. The next few days were busy with preparations. Mason purchased Miguel's 15 head of cattle and farm equipment, paying a fair price that would give the family a new start. The Sanchezes began packing their belongings, a somber task that the neighbors helped with as much as possible. Word of the situation spread through the community. Other farmers and ranchers stopped by to offer support, sharing similar stories of pressure from Blackwood or his representatives. A pattern emerged. The businessman was systematically acquiring properties that followed the path of Cottonwood Creek, the most reliable water source in the area. On Friday evening, the night before the eviction deadline, Mason rode to the Sutton homestead. He found Olivia alone on the porch, gazing at the stars. William had gone to town for supplies, and the Sanchez family was spending their last night in their own home. May I join you? Mason asked, climbing the steps after tethering his horse. Olivia nodded, making room on the bench beside her. I was just thinking about tomorrow. It doesn't seem right that a man like Blackwood can simply take what others have worked so hard to build. No, it doesn't, Mason agreed, settling beside her. Their shoulders almost touched, and he was acutely aware of her proximity in the quiet darkness. What if he comes for our lands next? She asked softly. I couldn't bear to lose this place. It represents everything William and I hoped to build after losing so much. Mason turned to face her, his decision made in that moment. I won't let that happen, Olivia. She looked at him, her eyes reflecting the starlight. How can you be sure? Because we'll stand together, all of us. He hesitated, then continued, his voice low with conviction. Since the war, I've avoided taking sides, getting involved. It seemed safer that way, but watching what's happening to Miguel and others, it reminds me that sometimes neutrality is just another word for surrender. Olivia's hand found his in the darkness. You're a good man, Mason, despite what you may think of yourself. Her touch sent warmth spreading through him, making it difficult to focus. I've done things I'm not proud of, Olivia. The war asked terrible things of everyone, she interrupted gently. My father treated men from both sides. Their uniforms were different, but their pain was the same. Her free hand rose hesitantly, then touched his scarred cheek. You're still handsome, you know. This doesn't change who you are. The simple gesture and her words broke something open inside Mason. Without thinking, he leaned forward and kissed her, softly at first, then with growing intensity as she responded. Her lips were warm and yielding beneath his, her hand moving from his cheek to the nape of his neck. When they finally parted, both slightly breathless, Mason searched her face in the moonlight, looking for any sign of regret or discomfort. Instead, he found her smiling, her eyes bright with emotion. I've been hoping you would do that for quite some time, she admitted. Mason laughed softly, a sound foreign to his own ears. I've been wanting to for months. I just didn't think that I could care for a man with a scar. She finished for him, her tone gently chiding. Mason, I fell in love with your character long before I fully saw your face. The scar is just part of your story, not your whole. The word love hung between them, powerful and transformative. Mason drew her closer, his arm encircling her waist. I'm not good with words, Olivia, but I care for you more than I thought possible. These past months, knowing you, being near you, it's changed me. She rested her head against his shoulder, fitting there as if the space had been made for her. Then we'll face whatever comes together. They sat in comfortable silence for a time, the night sounds of the prairie surrounding them, crickets chirping, the occasional call of a night bird, the soft whicker of Mason's horse from the hitching post. What do you think Blackwood really wants? Olivia eventually asked. It can't be just land. Mason considered the question. Water, most likely. Control of Cottonwood Creek would mean control of every ranch and farm for miles, and with the railroad survey crews that passed through last month, I'd guess he knows something about future development that we don't. The railroad coming here would change everything, Olivia mused. Land values, shipping costs for cattle, access to markets. Exactly, and whoever controls the water when that happens. Controls everything, she finished grimly. The sound of approaching hoofbeats interrupted their conversation. William appeared a moment later, his expression urgent as he dismounted. Blackwood's men are at the Sanchez place, he announced without preamble. 6 of them, armed. They're saying they're taking possession tonight, not waiting for morning. Mason stood immediately. Miguel and his family, still there. I rode past on my way back from town and saw the commotion. Elena was arguing with them at the door. We need to go, now. Mason was already moving toward his horse, Olivia right behind him. I'll get my rifle, William said, striding toward the house. They rode hard through the darkness, covering the distance to the Sanchez homestead in less than 20 minutes. As they approached, they could see lanterns illuminating the yard and hear raised voices. 6 mounted men surrounded the small house while Miguel stood on his porch, his own rifle in hand but pointed downward. This is private property until morning, Miguel was saying as they rode up. You have no right to be here before then. A burly man with a drooping mustache responded, his voice carrying across the yard. Mr. Blackwood says differently, we're taking possession now, get your family and belongings out or we'll remove them for you. Mason, Olivia, and William approached slowly, making their presence known. The tension in the yard shifted as the men turned to assess the newcomers. Evening, gentlemen, Mason said calmly, though his hand rested near his holstered revolver. Seems there's some confusion about timing. The eviction notice specified tomorrow morning. Who the hell are you? Demanded the mustached man, clearly the leader of Blackwood's crew, Mason Forrester. This is my neighbor Miguel Sanchez, and he's correct about the timing. You're trespassing until morning. The man spat on the ground. We don't answer to you, Scarface. We have our orders. From the corner of his eye, Mason saw William stiffen at the insult, but he gave a subtle shake of his head. Escalating to violence would only make things worse. Is Mr. Blackwood here? Olivia asked, her voice remarkably steady. I'd like to speak with him directly. The boss doesn't dirty his hands with this kind of business, another man replied with a harsh laugh. That's what he pays us for. Mason considered their options. 6 armed men against the 3 of them, and Miguel presented poor odds, especially with Elena and the children inside the house. Yet backing down now would only embolden Blackwood's men for future confrontations. Before he could decide on a course of action, the sound of multiple riders approaching drew everyone's attention. Sheriff Davis appeared, accompanied by 4 townsmen, all armed. What's going on here, Harker? The sheriff asked the mustached man, his voice carrying authority despite being outnumbered. Harker shifted uncomfortably in his saddle. Just carrying out Mr. Blackwood's instructions, Sheriff, taking possession of this property. The notice specified tomorrow morning, Davis replied evenly. And as I recall, it was my responsibility to oversee any necessary eviction, not private citizens. He surveyed the armed men with obvious disapproval. "I suggest you gentlemen return to town and come back at the proper time, with me present." For a moment, it seemed Harker might argue. Then, apparently thinking better of it, he nodded grudgingly. "Fine, first light tomorrow then." He turned his horse, gesturing for his men to follow. As they rode past Mason, he leaned down slightly. "This isn't over, Scarface, not by a long shot." Once Blackwood's men were out of earshot, Sheriff Davis approached the group. "Miguel, you and your family should leave tonight. I'll do what I can to ensure the eviction proceeds legally tomorrow, but those men are trouble." Miguel nodded, the resignation in his eyes tempered with gratitude. "Thank you for coming, Sheriff. We will be gone before dawn." "We'll help you pack the remaining items," Olivia offered, moving toward the house where Alina now stood in the doorway, her daughters clinging to her skirts. As the others went inside, Mason turned to Davis. "How did you know to come?" "Jenkins' son was in town when William rode through. Heard him telling the blacksmith about Blackwood's men heading out early. The boy rode to get me." The sheriff's expression was grim. "Blackwood's pushing too hard, too fast. People are starting to notice." "But is anyone willing to stand against him?" Mason asked. Davis gestured to the men who had accompanied him. "These fellows are, and others too. Folks don't take kindly to seeing their neighbors bullied, even if they're too afraid to act alone." The revelation that community sentiment was turning against Blackwood was encouraging, but Mason knew it might not be enough. The businessman had money, influence, and men willing to use violence on his behalf. They needed more than moral outrage to stop him. With the immediate crisis averted, they spent the next few hours helping the Sanchez family load their remaining possessions onto their wagon. Dawn was just breaking when Miguel, Elena, and their daughters departed, the girls sleeping in the back of the wagon among their household goods. Elena riding beside her husband on the seat, her face a mask of dignified sorrow. "We will never forget your kindness," Miguel said as he shook Mason's hand in farewell. "All of you." "This isn't permanent," Mason assured him. "We'll find a way to make this right." As the wagon disappeared down the road toward Mason's property, where they would temporarily stay in his barn loft, Sheriff Davis approached once more. "I need to stay and oversee the official transfer of property, but be careful, all of you. Blackwood doesn't strike me as a man who forgives opposition." Mason nodded his understanding. The sun was rising fully now, casting long shadows across the Sanchez homestead. Soon Blackwood's men would return, this time with legal authority to take possession. The thought left a bitter taste in Mason's mouth. Olivia's hand slipped into his as they mounted their horses. "This isn't over," she said quietly, echoing his words to Miguel, but with fierce determination rather than empty reassurance. "No," Mason agreed, squeezing her hand before releasing it to take up his reins. "It's just beginning." The next week passed in tense anticipation. Blackwood's men took possession of the Sanchez property as expected, but made no further moves against neighboring lands. Miguel and his family settled into the loft of Mason's barn, which William helped convert into more comfortable quarters. Elena found work cooking at the hotel in Fort Lyon, while Miguel assisted Mason with his expanded herd. Mason and Olivia's relationship deepened in the midst of these challenges. They spent every available moment together, sometimes talking for hours on his porch or riding across the rolling landscape of their adjoining properties. Mason found himself sharing stories he'd never told anyone about his childhood in Tennessee, the horrors he'd witnessed during the war, the aimless years that followed. Olivia listened without judgment, offering understanding and, when needed, gentle challenge to his darker perspectives. In turn, she spoke of her life in St. Louis, her father's medical practice, and the devastating losses their family suffered during the war, not just her father eventually, but 2 brothers and countless friends. Her resilience in the face of such tragedy amazed Mason, strengthening his growing conviction that he had found something precious beyond measure. Word reached them through Sheriff Davis that Blackwood had returned to Denver, but left Harker and 3 men behind to develop the Sanchez property. No actual improvements were being made, however. The men simply occupied the house and patrolled the boundaries, watching the neighboring ranches with obvious interest. On a clear October morning, Mason rode into Fort Lyon to mail a letter and purchase supplies. As he tied his horse outside the general store, he noticed an elegant carriage stopped in front of the hotel. A well-dressed woman was descending, assisted by a driver in livery. Something about her commanding presence drew his attention. Inside the store, Jenkins was unusually animated. "Did you see the carriage? That's Victoria Blackwood herself, Edmund's sister. Word is she's the real business mind behind their empire, twice as sharp and 3 times as ruthless as her brother, they say." Mason processed this information with interest. What brings her to Fort Lyon? Jenkins shrugged. "No idea, but when someone like that appears in a town this size, it usually means something significant is afoot." After completing his purchases, Mason decided to linger in town, curious about the Blackwood woman's presence. He took a table at the small cafe across from the hotel, positioning himself where he could observe the entrance while appearing to read a newspaper. He didn't have to wait long. Within an hour, Victoria Blackwood emerged, accompanied by Harrison from the bank and another man Mason didn't recognize, expensively dressed, with the bearing of someone accustomed to authority. The three conversed briefly before parting ways, Victoria returning to the hotel while the men headed toward the bank. As Mason prepared to leave, Sheriff Davis slid into the chair opposite him. "Noticed you watching the Blackwood woman," he said without preamble. Curious about our distinguished visitor, Mason folded his newspaper. "Should I be?" The man with her was Samuel Whitmore, representative for the Denver Pacific Railway. They're finalizing the route for the spur line that will connect Fort Lyon to the main track. Davis lowered his voice. "And guess where that line is projected to run?" "Through the Sanchez property," Mason guessed, the pieces falling into place. Davis nodded. "And the Peterson place and likely parts of yours and the Suttons as well. A railway needs water access for the steam engines. Cottonwood Creek provides that. So Blackwood is acquiring land he knows will be valuable to the railway," Mason said, anger building within him. "Using the bank to force foreclosures on properties in the path. It appears so, though proving it would be another matter entirely." The sheriff's expression was troubled. "I've sent a telegram to the federal marshal's office in Denver suggesting they investigate, but Blackwood has friends in high places. I wouldn't count on swift action." Mason thanked Davis for the information and rode back to his ranch, his mind working through the implications. If the railway was indeed planning a spur line through their properties, it explained Blackwood's targeted acquisitions. It also meant that the Sutton's land and his own would soon be in jeopardy. He found Olivia at his cabin, where she had come to bring lunch and check on the Sanchez family. When he shared what he had learned, her expression grew increasingly troubled. "If that's true, none of our properties are safe," she said. "Blackwood will find ways to force us out one by one." "Not if we expose his scheme first," Mason replied. "Davis has contacted the federal marshal, but we need more concrete evidence of the connection between Blackwood and the railway plans." Olivia considered this. "Victoria Blackwood's presence is significant. She rarely involves herself directly in their acquisitions, according to what I've heard in town, which suggests this is particularly important to their interests." Mason paced the small confines of his cabin. "We need to find out exactly what she's planning while she's here." That evening, they gathered at the Sutton homestead. Mason, Olivia, William, Miguel, and Sheriff Davis, who had ridden out to join them after his duties in town were complete. Around the kitchen table, they shared what they knew and formulated a plan. "Victoria Blackwood is staying at the hotel for 3 more days," Davis informed them. "Tomorrow evening, there's to be a meeting in the hotel's private dining room. Her, Harrison, Whitmore from the railway, and Edmund Blackwood himself, who's arriving on the afternoon stage. If we could somehow overhear that meeting," William suggested, "we might gather the evidence we need." "The hotel staff might help," Olivia offered. "Elena has made friends with the cook and some of the maids. They've been sympathetic to her situation." They discussed various approaches, eventually settling on a plan that would require cooperation from hotel staff and precise timing. Miguel would speak with his wife, who would approach her colleagues for assistance. If they succeeded, they might obtain the proof needed to challenge the Blackwoods' methods. As the others continued refining details, Mason stepped outside for air, the weight of responsibility settling heavily on his shoulders. He had come to Fort Lyon seeking peace and a fresh start, only to find himself embroiled in a conflict that threatened everything he had begun to build, not just his ranch, but his future with Olivia. She joined him moments later, her shawl drawn tight against the evening chill. "You're worried," she observed, standing close beside him. "We're risking a lot," he acknowledged. "Blackwood isn't a man to cross lightly." Olivia's hand found his in the darkness. "Some things are worth the risk." "Our homes, our community," she hesitated, then continued softly, "our future together." Mason turned to face her, his heart suddenly racing. "Is that what you want, a future together?" Even in the dim light, he could see the certainty in her eyes. "More than anything, I love you, Mason Forrester. Scars and all, past and present. Whatever comes, I want to face it by your side." He drew her into his arms, overwhelmed by emotion. "I love you, Olivia. I never thought I'd find you after everything. You've brought me back to life in ways I can't even explain." Their kiss was tender yet passionate, a promise exchanged without words. When they finally parted, Mason held her close, his cheek resting against her hair. "When this is over," he said quietly, "will you marry me?" Olivia looked up at him, her smile radiant in the moonlight. "Yes. 1,000 times yes." The plan was set in motion the following morning. Elena spoke with her colleagues at the hotel, securing the cooperation of a maid named Hannah who would be serving the private dinner that evening. Hannah agreed to leave the service door slightly ajar, allowing someone to listen from the adjacent storeroom. William would position himself to overhear the conversation, while Mason and Davis would wait nearby, ready to intervene if necessary. Miguel would remain with his daughters, and Olivia would stay at Mason's ranch, away from any potential danger. "I don't like being left behind," Olivia protested when Mason explained this final detail. "I'm as invested in this as any of you." "Which is precisely why I need to know you're safe," Mason replied, taking her hands in his. "If something goes wrong, if Blackwood discovers our plan, there could be consequences. Please, Olivia." She reluctantly agreed, though her expression made it clear she was doing so under protest. They spent the afternoon together, both preoccupied with thoughts of the evening ahead. As dusk approached, Mason prepared to ride into town. Before mounting his horse, he took Olivia in his arms once more. "Be careful," she whispered against his chest. "Come back to me." "Always," he promised, kissing her one last time before riding away. Fort Lyon was quiet when Mason arrived, the usual evening activities subdued by an early autumn chill. He met William and Sheriff Davis behind the livery stable as planned, reviewing their strategy one final time. "Hannah says the Blackwoods and their guests will begin dinner at 7, William reported. "I'll position myself in the storeroom by 6:30, Davis nodded. "I'll be in the hotel lobby, keeping an eye on the main entrance. Mason, you watch the back. If anything seems amiss, we abort immediately. This is about gathering information, not confrontation." The men separated to take their positions. Mason circled around to the rear of the hotel, finding a shadowed spot between stacked crates where he could observe the service entrance without being noticed. The minutes crawled by with agonizing slowness as he waited, every sense alert for danger. At precisely 6:30, William slipped through the service door according to plan. 10 minutes later, a carriage arrived at the front of the hotel. Through the alley, Mason caught glimpses of Edmund Blackwood, as elegantly dressed as his sister, being greeted by Harrison and Whitmore before they all entered the hotel. Another 20 minutes passed. Mason shifted position occasionally to keep his muscles from stiffening in the cool evening air. Suddenly, the service door opened, and a hotel employee emerged, lighting a cigarette. Mason tensed, concerned the man might spot William inside, but he merely smoked quietly before returning inside. Just as Mason was beginning to wonder if their plan was working, he heard the sound of approaching horses, several of them, moving at a steady pace. Moments later, Harker and 3 of Blackwood's men rode into view, dismounting near the hotel's back entrance. Their presence was unexpected and concerning. Mason pressed deeper into the shadows, watching as the men conferred briefly before 2 of them entered through the service door while Harker and the remaining man took positions outside. This development complicated matters significantly. William was now potentially trapped inside with Blackwood's men nearby. Mason needed to alert Davis, but moving from his position might draw attention from Harker. As he debated his options, the service door opened again, and Hannah the maid slipped out, moving quickly toward the alley where Mason was hidden. "Are you with Mr. Sutton?" she whispered urgently when she spotted him. "You need to get him out." Blackwood's men are searching the hotel. Someone tipped them off about possible eavesdropping. Mason's heart sank. Their plan had been discovered. Where is William now? Still in the storeroom, but they'll check there soon. There's a window that opens to the side alley. If he's quick, he might get out that way. Can you tell him? Without being noticed, Hannah nodded. "I'll try, but hurry, they're being thorough." As she disappeared back inside, Mason moved cautiously toward the side alley she had indicated. He needed to be ready when William emerged, but also had to somehow alert Davis to the situation. The complexity of their predicament increased when he heard raised voices from inside. Someone had discovered something. Mason drew his revolver, moving more quickly now. As he reached the corner of the building, William came crashing through a small window, landing awkwardly in the alley. Mason hurried to help him up. "They found me," William gasped, blood trickling from a cut on his forehead, "but I heard enough." "The railway deal is definite. They're paying Blackwood 3 times the market value for the land he's acquired in the creek path." "Later," Mason urged, pulling William toward the shadows as the sounds of pursuit became audible inside the hotel. "We need to find Davis and get out of town." They moved swiftly through back alleys, avoiding the main street where they might be spotted. As they neared the livery stable where they had left their horses, 2 of Blackwood's men appeared, blocking their path. "Well, well," said one, drawing his gun. "Look what we found." The scar-faced rancher and his young friend. Mason pushed William behind him, his own weapon raised. "We want no trouble, just let us pass." The second man laughed unpleasantly. "Mr. Blackwood wants a word with you both. I suggest you come along peacefully." "I'm afraid that won't be possible," came Sheriff Davis's voice from behind the men. His revolver was already drawn. "Lower your weapons, gentlemen, now." For a tense moment, it seemed the men might resist. Then, recognizing the disadvantage of their position, they slowly placed their guns on the ground. "This is official business, Sheriff," the first man protested. "These men were trespassing, spying on a private meeting." "Is that so?" Davis replied evenly. "Interesting, since I've received no complaint of trespassing. What I do see is 2 armed men threatening citizens of my town." He gestured with his weapon. "Now move along and tell Mr. Blackwood if he has concerns, he can address them to me directly." The men retreated, their expressions promising future retribution. Once they were out of sight, Davis turned to Mason and William. "You boys all right?" William nodded, wiping blood from his brow. "Thanks to your timing." "What happened?" Davis asked as they hurried toward the livery stable. William quickly related what he had overheard before being discovered: confirmation of the railway deal, specific mentions of the foreclosed properties, and most damningly, discussion of which properties to target next, including both the Sutton and Forrester ranches. "They're planning to use water rights as leverage against us," William explained as they saddled their horses, "claiming that the creek access was legally part of the Sanchez property and that we've been using it without proper authority." "That's nonsense," Mason growled. "The water rights were clearly established in all our deeds. Doesn't matter if the bank and local judge are in their pocket," Davis said grimly. "They'll create whatever legal fiction serves their purpose." They rode out of town at a gallop, taking a circuitous route in case Blackwood's men attempted to follow. Only when they were certain they weren't being pursued did they slow to a more sustainable pace. "What now?" William asked, the excitement of their escape giving way to concern. Blackwood knows we're onto him. He'll accelerate his plans. We need to get word to the federal marshal immediately, Davis said. What you overheard tonight is evidence of fraud and conspiracy. I'll send a telegram first thing tomorrow. And in the meantime, Mason pressed. Blackwood won't wait for the law to catch up. Davis considered this. Gather your neighbors, everyone with property along the creek. Strength in numbers may be our best immediate defense. They parted ways at the crossroads, Davis returning to town while Mason and William continued toward their homes. As they neared the Sutton property, Mason felt a growing sense of unease. William, something's wrong. He pointed toward the horizon where an orange glow illuminated the night sky in the direction of his ranch. Fire! They spurred their horses to a gallop, covering the remaining distance at breakneck speed. As they crested the final hill, the source of the glow became horrifyingly clear. Mason's barn was engulfed in flames, the fire spreading rapidly toward the nearby cabin. Olivia, Mason shouted, his heart seizing with fear. He urged his horse forward, barely registering William's shout behind him. As he neared the burning structures, he saw figures moving in the firelight, Miguel and Alina working desperately to control the blaze with buckets from the well, and Olivia directing their efforts. Relief washed over him at the sight of her, unharmed and fighting with characteristic determination. He dismounted in a rush, running to join them. What happened? He demanded, taking a bucket from Alina's exhausted hands. Blackwood's men, Olivia answered, her face smudged with soot. 4 of them. They came just after sunset, said it was a message from their employer. Her voice broke slightly. The girls are safe there in the root cellar. Mason looked toward his cabin, which was now beginning to burn despite their efforts. The well couldn't provide enough water to save both structures, and the barn was already beyond salvation. Let the barn go, he instructed grimly. Focus on the cabin. For the next hour, they fought desperately to contain the fire, forming a bucket brigade between the well and the cabin. William rode to alert neighboring ranchers who arrived in groups to assist. By midnight, they had managed to save the cabin, though one wall was badly damaged and the roof was partially collapsed. The barn was a total loss, reduced to smoldering ruins in the darkness. As dawn broke, Mason surveyed the destruction with Olivia by his side. His cattle had scattered during the fire but appeared to have avoided injury. The Sanchez family's possessions, stored in the barn loft, were gone. I'm so sorry, Olivia said, her hand tight in his. Miguel blames himself for bringing this trouble to your door. This isn't Miguel's fault, Mason replied firmly. It's Blackwood's and he'll answer for it. Throughout the morning, neighbors continued to arrive, offering assistance and support. The community's response was overwhelming. Women brought food, men offered tools and labor to begin repairs, everyone expressing outrage at the attack. By mid-afternoon, Sheriff Davis arrived with troubling news. Edmund Blackwood left town on the morning stage, but his sister remains. When I confronted her about the fire, she expressed shock but suggested that unfortunate accidents occur when people meddle in affairs beyond their understanding. That's as good as a confession, William said angrily. Davis nodded. I thought so too. I've sent a detailed report to the federal marshal, including William's account of the railway conversation and this latest incident. But until they respond, we need to be vigilant. We're beyond vigilance, Mason stated, his decision made. It's time to fight back. That evening, representatives from 12 local ranches and farms gathered at the Sutton homestead. The mood was resolute as Mason and William explained what they had learned about Blackwood's railway scheme. They're trying to drive us off our land through intimidation and legal manipulation, Mason concluded. But together, we can resist. The gathering quickly evolved into a formal association of landowners committed to mutual defense and support. They established night patrols of the properties, organized repair crews for Mason's damaged buildings, and pooled resources to hire a lawyer from Denver who specialized in land disputes. As the meeting concluded, one of the older ranchers approached Mason. We should have done this months ago when the Petersons lost their place. It took your stand to wake us up." He extended his hand. "We're with you now, though, all the way." The next week was a whirlwind of activity. Work crews rebuilt Mason's barn and repaired his cabin. The night patrols intercepted and turned back 2 attempts by Blackwood's men to harass outlying properties. The lawyer from Denver arrived, reviewing all property deeds and water rights documents, confirming that the landowner's claims were legally sound. Most significantly, a telegram arrived from the federal marshal's office, indicating that an investigation had been launched into the Blackwood siblings' business practices, particularly regarding the railway deal. Sheriff Davis was instructed to gather additional testimonies from affected landowners. Victoria Blackwood remained in Fort Lyon throughout this period, her presence a constant reminder of the threat they faced. She made no further overt moves against the landowners, but her frequent meetings with Harrison at the bank suggested continued plotting. 10 days after the fire, Mason was overseeing the final repairs to his cabin when Olivia rode up, her expression urgent. "Victoria Blackwood is leaving," she announced. "Her carriage is being prepared at the hotel, William's in town keeping watch." Mason set down his tools immediately. Davis should know, this could mean her brother is sending reinforcements or they're changing tactics. They rode to town together, finding William observing the hotel from across the street. Victoria's elegant carriage was indeed ready for departure, her driver loading the last of her luggage. "She received a telegram this morning," William reported. Whatever it said, it's prompted this sudden departure. As they watched, Victoria emerged from the hotel, followed by Harrison. The banker appeared agitated, gesturing emphatically as they spoke. Victoria's response was too quiet to overhear, but her posture suggested irritation rather than concern. Sheriff Davis joined them moments later. "Just got word myself. Interesting timing, isn't it?" "What do you mean?" Olivia asked. "The federal marshal is arriving tomorrow with a warrant to examine the bank's records regarding the foreclosures." Davis's expression was grim satisfaction. "Seems your evidence struck a chord in Denver." Victoria's carriage departed shortly after, heading not west toward Denver as expected, but east along the stage road. The significance wasn't lost on any of them. "She's running," William said, "or regrouping," Mason cautioned. "This isn't over yet." They were right to remain vigilant. That night, Harker and 6 men attempted to raid the Sutton property, only to be intercepted by the landowner's patrol. A brief exchange of gunfire resulted in one of Blackwood's men being wounded before they retreated. The federal marshal, a stern-faced man named Forrester, arrived the following day with 2 deputies. He immediately sequestered himself in the bank with Harrison, emerging hours later with documents packed in a leather satchel. His meeting with the landowners at Davis's office was brief but encouraging. "There's evidence of substantial irregularities in the bank's handling of foreclosures," Forrester informed them, "and clear documentation of the connection between Blackwood and the railway company that wasn't disclosed to affected landowners as required by territorial law." "What does that mean for the Sanchez property?" Miguel asked, hope evident in his voice for the first time in weeks. "If the evidence holds up, the foreclosures could be invalidated," Forrester replied cautiously. "But these matters take time. Legal proceedings will be necessary." "And Blackwood himself," Mason pressed, the marshal's expression hardened. "We have men looking for him and his sister now. The telegraph lines are busy with descriptions. They won't find it easy to conduct business anywhere in the territory." It wasn't the immediate resolution they had hoped for, but it was progress. The community maintained its vigilance in the days that followed, though Blackwood's remaining men gradually disappeared from the area, presumably abandoning their posts without leadership or payment. 3 weeks after the marshal's visit, official notice arrived the Sanchez foreclosure had been declared invalid due to evidence of fraud and collusion. Miguel and his family could reclaim their property immediately. Similar notices followed for other affected landowners. The community gathered at the Sanchez homestead to celebrate their return, a joyous occasion marked by shared food, music, and the sense of justice restored. Mason watched as Alina embraced Olivia, both women tearful with happiness, and felt a profound gratitude for the community they had built together. Later that evening, as the celebration continued under lantern light, Mason and Olivia slipped away for a moment of privacy. They walked hand in hand along Cottonwood Creek, the water reflecting moonlight in rippling patterns. "We did it," Olivia said softly, leaning against his shoulder. "I almost can't believe it's over." "Not quite over," Mason replied. "Blackwood may yet return, though not with the same advantage. And the railway will still come eventually, on more honest terms. But we'll face those challenges together, all of us." She turned to look up at him. "And you and I will face them as husband and wife," Mason smiled, touching her cheek tenderly, "if you'll still have this scarred old cowboy." Olivia's fingers traced the silver line down his jaw, her touch gentle yet sure. "You're still handsome, you know. This doesn't change who you are." She rose on tiptoe to kiss him, her lips warm and sweet against his. "And I love exactly who you are, Mason Forrester." They were married 3 weeks later in the small church in Fort Lyon, surrounded by friends and neighbors who had become like family through their shared struggle. William stood as Mason's best man, while Alina was Olivia's matron of honor. Even Sheriff Davis dressed in his Sunday best for the occasion. The Blackwood siblings never returned to Colorado territory. Reports filtered back over the following months that they had fled to California after federal charges were filed regarding their business practices. The railway eventually established its spur line through Fort Lyon, negotiating fair compensation with all landowners along the route. Mason and Olivia built their life together on the land they had defended, expanding the ranch and, a year after their marriage, welcoming a son they named James after Olivia's father. The scar on Mason's face faded somewhat with time, becoming simply another feature of a face beloved by his wife and later by his children. On their 5th wedding anniversary, as they sat on the porch of their expanded home watching the sunset, Mason reflected on the journey that had brought them together. "I came here looking for a quiet place to exist," he said, his arm around Olivia's shoulders, "never imagining I'd find all this." Olivia smiled, leaning into his embrace. "Sometimes the deepest wounds lead us to unexpected healing." Her fingers traced the familiar line of his scar, the gesture now one of affection rather than treatment. "And sometimes a scar is just a reminder of battles survived and life fully lived." In the distance, their son played with the Sanchez daughters, their laughter carrying across the yard where once there had been only silence. Mason kissed his wife's temple, grateful beyond words for the woman who had seen beyond his scars to the man beneath, and in doing so had helped him see himself again. Together they had built something neither could have created alone, not just a ranch or a family, but a community founded on principles of mutual support and justice. The scar that had once seemed to define Mason's future had instead marked the beginning of a journey neither of them could have anticipated, but one they would treasure for all their days. As twilight deepened into night, they remained on the porch, speaking quietly of tomorrow's plans and next season's hopes, secure in the knowledge that whatever challenges arose, they would face them together, scarred perhaps by life's battles, but undiminished in strength and unwavering in love.